Disclaimer: the contents of Studio 151 podcasts and the TU Communication Disorders Connection podcast do not represent the views and beliefs of the University of Tulsa and the Mary Kay Chapman Center. The content covered in this podcast reflects knowledge we've obtained from the ASHA Practice Portal, as well as our own personal, clinical, and educational experiences. Hello, welcome back to another episode of the TU Communication Disorders Connection podcast. This is your host, Alyssa Hall. And today I'm joined in the studio by one of my fellow first-year graduate students, Meredith Atchley. Meredith, it's good to have you here in the studio today.
It's good to be here.
Today, Meredith and I are going to be covering sort of a general overview of the SLP Big 9 area of AAC. So I'm just going to jump right on in with some questions for Meredith. For some of our unfamiliar listeners, what does AAC stand for?
AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. It is considered augmentative when used to supplement existing speech, alternative when used in place of speech that is absent or not functional, or temporary as when used by patients post-operatively in intensive care. AAC also can incorporate the individual's full communication abilities and may include any existing speech or vocalizations, gestures, manual signs, and aided communication.
That's interesting. I feel like with speech paths, we get into the mindset of it's just like a communication device. But a person can use AAC with tech, without, or things as simple as like gestures and vocalizations. Just any alternative method of communicating.
Exactly.
With that wide range of devices we might use, what kinds of people might be needing AAC?
So people of all ages can use AAC devices if they have trouble with speech and language skills. AAC is also used by people who, some or all of the time, cannot rely on their own speech. And then by recent estimates, there are well over 2 million people who present with significant expressive language impairments, and they use AAC devices. They can encounter difficulty communicating via speech due to different congenital and acquired disabilities that occur across their lifespan. So they might not start with needing AAC, but eventually as they get older, they need some to help. These conditions include autism, cerebral palsy, dual sensory impairments, genetic syndromes, intellectual disabilities, multiple disabilities, hearing impairment, disease, stroke, and head injuries.
Wide range
Very,
of people. I think that's part of the beauty. Depending on people's specific needs, you can kind of like individualize the methods of alternative communication you're using or providing for them. So a term that I hear with AAC often is the concept of communication being aided or unaided. Can you explain that distinction?
Sure. Unaided modes of communication may include non-spoken means of natural communication, so this includes gestures and facial expressions. This can also include manual signs. These modes of communication often require adequate motor control and communication partners who can also interpret the intended message, while aided modes of communication include those approaches that require some form of external support, such as communication boards with symbols. These symbols can include objects, photographs, line drawings, visual graphic symbols, printed words, and traditional orthography. Those with complex or severe speech and language needs may utilize both aided and unaided AAC devices to communicate, depending on the situation and environment they're in. Like, for example, a child might sign and do sign language at home, but uses a picture-based system or a speech-generating device in public or with other communication partners who don't know sign language.
I feel like often you consider not just what they're able to access, but how much effort it takes to access something. It's like even if someone has the abilities to operate a device with their hand, that added physical or cognitive load is something to consider, and whether they can bring that out into the world with them. And so really you want something that's sustainable, that's practical, and that they're able to use independently.
Yes.
Or if their main strategy is not to use a device independently, make sure that they have some kind of independent communication they can fall back on.
Along with all that, Meredith, what's the difference between high-tech and low-tech AAC?
So, low-tech or no-tech options may include things like gestures and facial expressions, writing, drawing, spelling words by pointing to letters, or pointing to photos, pictures, or written words. Some high-tech options may include things like using an app on an iPad or a tablet to communicate, and using a computer with a voice, sometimes called a speech-generating device.
I feel like sometimes there's this bias towards the more high-tech side of AAC because you have more communication options within that. But looking at all these low-tech options we've mentioned, we're familiar with the processes of writing. We're familiar with the processes of using gestures. Most people are. And those existing skills can really be a more approachable communication option for someone who's first diving into the world of AAC if they have the abilities to use those strategies.
Exactly.
We've touched on this briefly, but what are some other factors someone might consider when they're selecting a device?
There are no specific prerequisites for a specific device, whether that be like age, cognition, linguistics, or motor functioning. So they can really get started with any type of AAC they deem necessary. The decision to introduce AAC should be made in consultation with the person wanting to use the device, their family, and a team of professionals who know the range of devices and know their pros and cons. Also, choosing an aided AAC system requires careful consideration of the individual's current skills, their strengths, and their needs, but it's also important not to restrict the individual's potential to learn how to use the AAC device and how many words and symbols that can be on it as well. So assessing for an AAC device can determine the options for different symbols, systems, and access modes, the context where the individual must communicate, the skills and supports available to partners, the profile of the individual that can include vision, hearing, sensory motor, motivation to use the device, cognition, linguistic skills, literacy skills, and their current modes of communication. Some other factors to consider might include the durability, reliability, and battery life of the device, the cost and licensing of the device, how easy it is to use, some security features, storage, screen size, touchscreen, and communication partners, etc. when it comes to what AAC device works best for that person.
A lot of considerations that we make with any kind of device.
Exactly.
Not even a dedicated communication device. So I feel like there's this assumption that like, oh, I can just get an iPad or I can just put an app on it. And that does work for a lot of people and that's a lot more accessible. But kids fall. Kids are easily able to work around technology and having that dedicated device that they can't just quickly switch to a game or fall and break or throw.
Exactly.
Sometimes they throw. Are all important considerations to make. So Meredith, you talked a little bit about the role of AAC in facilitating like expressive language. Can you talk a little bit about how an AAC device might help communication or language development?
Sure. A lot of people actually wonder if introducing and using an AAC device will stop someone from talking or will slow down their language development, especially if they're young kids who are not currently talking or meeting their developmental milestones. But this is not true. Research has shown that AAC can actually help with these concerns. People who use AAC can also learn how to read and write as well, so this will not stop them from reading and writing. It can also give a person with limited speech more words and language to use. So with the symbols, they can connect the symbols to words and what it sounds like if it's a speech-generating device. Not only that, but literacy instruction for AAC users may incorporate the AAC device and task adaptations that can support literacy learning in children with complex communication needs. Literacy intervention for children who use AAC may also include instruction on how to read for a variety of purposes while drawing on their own relevant background knowledge and personal experiences. For children with disabilities, the skills to support language development often must be explicitly taught. So this includes building both the receptive and expressive vocabulary, including both spoken words and the AAC symbols. So some specific types of vocabulary may need to be targeted, whether that be teaching verbs and adjectives to a child who primarily uses nouns when using the device. Once the child has acquired a good number of words and AAC symbols, they can also be taught how to combine those words to form sentences.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that last point about things needing to be explicitly taught that might not in like typical language development, because you think around babies, around young children, we're constantly communicating through verbal language, and they're always getting that auditory input or getting a view of a model, several models, and how people use language to them, but also how people communicate with each other. And we're not going around in our day using communication devices in front of them. And so it needs to be more of a conscious effort to get in there, use the device to communicate with them, give them more strategies to use their device, but also maybe use the device to communicate with someone else in the presence of them.
Providing them with examples and modeling is a huge aspect of learning how to use the AAC device.
Yeah, and you've talked about communication partner involvement being a huge aspect in like device selection, and having a better knowledge of the device that your loved one is using, how it operates, how to troubleshoot and help them if something is not working the way it needs to. That's a major part of being an effective communication partner, because it's a two-way street. It's a team effort to communicate and have a relationship.
For sure.
All right, Meredith, in your clinical experience thus far at the Mary Kay Chapman Center, have you had any experiences working with clients with AAC?
Yes, actually. Last fall, I had one client who was starting to learn how to use his new AAC device. It was the LAMP program on an iPad at the time, and so we were working a lot on learning the symbols, learning how to navigate each page of symbols, and how to put 2 to 3 words together at that point. He has speech, however, he has apraxia, so a lot of his speech was very unintelligible, especially to new communication partners who didn't already know him. So this AAC device is only supposed to be used part of the time. So we're still encouraging those speech sounds and working on his individual speech sounds. However, this AAC device was supposed to aid in that communication to decrease any frustration that he has when it comes to not being understood. So yeah, he usually only uses the AAC device when others are having trouble understanding his speech, but it was definitely a learning process for both me and him, as we both were learning and navigating this new device that he can hopefully continue to grow and use more and more.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the use of a device is not something that's going to stunt his verbal speech and language, as long as you're intentional about addressing both.
Exactly.
So that's a really cool application. I think it's easy to think about AAC in the context of someone who's nonverbal or is not communicating via language, but it can be used by anyone who needs a different way to express themselves. All right, Meredith, I think with that, we are going to wrap up our discussion over the Big 9 area of AAC. I want to thank you again for joining us in the studio.
Thank you for having me again.
And for all of you who listened along today, thank you for listening. I hope we will catch you in the next episode. Goodbye.
For further information or podcast ideas you'd like to share with us, please reach out at 918-631-2504. And remember, communication is not just about words, it's about understanding, empathy, and connection. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep communicating.